In this course section, we are now going to leave our standard Next.js page and especially the standard pages we've worked with thus far. Instead, in this course section, we're going to take a look at another Next.js feature, which is called API routes. And therefore, in this section, we're going to learn what exactly API routes are and why they exist. And we're going to explore how we can add API routes and how we can work with those API routes when we need them. And last but not least, we're going to take a closer look at dealing with requests and responses inside of API routes. And therefore, let's not waste any time and dive right in. Now, what are API routes? It's important to understand and keep in mind that some websites which you're building don't just need HTML pages that are being served back to visitors upon requests. That, of course, is something which most websites need, but it's not the only thing that can be needed by a website. You might, for example, have a feature on your website that allows users to submit feedback or sign up for a newsletter. Now, when a user clicks such a button to, for example, sign up for a newsletter, you don't necessarily want to show a different page. I mean, you could show a confirmation page that it was successful, but you could also just show a little info pop-up or banner on the existing page. But even if we ignore what we show, let's think about what happens behind the scenes when we sign up for a newsletter. Then we need to send data to some server, to some computer, to then store that entered newsletter email address in some database. And that request which is being sent there is not about fetching a site, it is about storing data. So it's kind of the other direction. We don't want to get a HTML page, instead we want to send that user entered data to some database. And that is what we use APIs for, application programming interfaces. There are different kinds of APIs we could build. REST APIs are the most popular form of APIs, and the idea is always the same. That we have a web server that exposes certain URLs, just as we did it thus far in the course, but those URLs are not about getting requests and sending back HTML data, but they are about accepting some data and then sending back responses with any kind of data, not necessarily HTML. Specifically, JSON, JavaScript Object Notation, would be the most common format for exchanging such data. So API routes are special kind of URLs which you can add to your Next.js application, which are not about getting a standard browser request and sending back a pre-rendered HTML page, but which are instead about getting data, using data, maybe storing data in some database, and sending back data in any form of your choice. So in the end, API routes, this Next.js feature, is a feature that allows us to build a API, a REST API, if you will, as part of our Next.js app. And it would, for example, allow us to support URLs or paths after our domain like this, /API feedback, and then accepting different kinds of HTTP requests. Not just GET requests, as all our page routes did thus far, but also POST or PUT or delete requests, whatever you need. And then, depending on which HTTP method was used for which path, different actions could be triggered. For example, for a POST request sent to /API/feedback, we might expect some data to be sent along with that incoming request, some feedback data entered by a user, and then when that request hits our API, we extract that data from the request and store it in a database. If a GET request reaches that same URL, we instead might want to fetch data from a database and send that back. but not as a HTML page, but instead as raw data in that JSON format. And those API routes, therefore, don't exist to be entered in the URL typically, but instead to be triggered via JavaScript code, via AJAX requests. So we as a developer add certain code to our page that sends these behind the scenes requests, you could say, to our API to store or fetch data. And that is actually something we already did in this course. When we worked with Firebase, when we sent requests to Firebase, then there we talked to the Firebase API. We sent requests to certain URLs for storing data and for getting data. And these URLs, these Firebase URLs, we didn't enter them in the browser. Instead, we sent requests through our JavaScript code, no matter if that code then runs on the client or on the server. We talked to that Firebase API. And now this API routes feature is about letting us define our own API endpoints as part of our Next.js application. Now, how do we add our own API routes to a Next.js application though? For this, I got a brand new Next.js project for you. You'll find it attached to this lecture. You can extract it, run npm install, and then once you did that, npm run dev to start it. But this application will now not be about our pages, at least not the standard pages. Indeed, there only is one page in that starting project, and that's a dummy homepage, which just says the homepage. Now, of course, we can visit this page through localhost 3000, but again, this course module will not be about creating pages like this. Instead, it is about this API routes feature, which is a feature built into Next.js. We can add our own API endpoints to Next.js by simply creating a new subfolder inside of Pages. So inside of this Pages directory, we create a subfolder, and that subfolder has to be called API. Now, up to this point, those file and folder names were mostly up to you. This is now not up to you. This has to be called API, because that's a special folder which will be recognized by Next.js. And any pages, if you want to call them like this, which you set up inside of that API folder will be treated in a special way. So let's add a page inside of the API folder. In there, you can add pages just as you can add them anywhere else in the pages folder. So you can pick names of your choice, index.js to handle requests which are just directed at /API, or to get started here, feedback.js. Let's name it feedback.js. So now I have that feedback.js file in the API folder in the pages folder. Now that will create a special path we can send requests to. It will allow us to send requests to our domain. So during development, that's localhost 3000 /API/feedback. This is what this will enable us to do. And that should make sense because we're in the API folder, in the pages folder, and we have a feedback.js file. Nonetheless, I mentioned that files and folders inside of API, so inside of this API folder, would be treated in a special way. And they will. Inside of any file inside of the API folder, like this feedback.js file, we don't export a React component. So in the other page files, we do create a React component and export that as a default. We don't do that in API routes. Instead here, we create a function which we typically should name handler because it will handle incoming requests, and a function which will get two parameters, a request object, which we could name rec, and a response object, which we could name res. And it's this function which we should export as a default here. Now that will not be a React component. This is a standard JavaScript function. Now, because this file is in the API folder, Next.js will kind of take this function here to execute it for incoming requests sent to /API/feedback. And the interesting thing is that now inside of this function, we can not just handle GET requests, and we don't have to send back HTML code. Instead, this allows us to execute any server-side code of our choice. And that's important, server-side code. Any code we write in here will never end up in any client-side code bundle. So any code we write here will never be exposed to visitors of our web page. Just as code written in getStaticProps and getServerSideProps would never be exposed to our visitors. It's the same here for these API routes and the code related to them. So here in Handler, for a basic start, we could start sending back a response. And we do that with help of that response object. Now, if you have some Node.js or Express.js experience, this will look very familiar to you. And indeed here we will write Node.js code enhanced by the Next.js team to look a bit like Express.js. For example, we can send back a response with help of that response object here. And on that object, we can call special methods that allow us to send back that response and to configure that response. For example, the status method allows us to set a status code. And that could be 200 for the start to set a success status code. Then on that method, we can chain another method, so call a method on the result of this first method call. And that could be the JSON method to send back some JSON data as part of the response for incoming requests. And that is quite standard. As I mentioned before, for APIs, you typically exchange data in that JSON format because it's a highly machine-readable and also human-readable data format, which is the de facto standard for exchanging data with APIs. Now, to the JSON method, we pass a JavaScript value, like an object, that will then be transformed into JSON automatically. And here we could have a message property. This is up to you though. This entire object is up to you. You can put any data you want in there. And the message could be "this works," like this. So by adding this line of code in that handler method, which is exported as a default, this will be executed by Next.js when we send a request to /API/feedback. And this code will then send back a response. Clearly not a page, clearly not a HTML response, but instead some JSON data. Because this response is not intended to be consumed by entering this in the browser. We will enter this URL in the browser for now to start working with API routes, but that is not how we will then use them on a real page. It's really just to get started. So if we save this feedback.js file now, and I then send a request to /API/feedback, we see our JSON response here. And if we open up the network tab in the DevTools and we reload to take a closer look at that response, we see the response data there as well. And in the headers, where we see some metadata about that request and response, we also see that in the response headers, the content type was set to application JSON. So this is now a special kind of page because we created that file in the special folder, and that code now allows us to run our own server-side code and to add our own application-focused API to our overall website, and that allows us to add features like newsletter sign up, user feedback submission, maybe comment submission, or anything else you need. And to really be able to add such features, let's now dig a bit deeper and explore how these API routes can be used. Now, to explore working with those API routes, let's go back to our standard index.js file, so to this standard homepage route, which is not an API route. And in there, I will add a basic form, which I'll not style in any way for the moment, where I then want to add an input of type email, let's say, and above that a label where I say your email address with a HTML4 tag of email, and then here an ID of email for accessibility. And then I'll put that into a div just to kind of put this into its own block and force a line break thereafter. And then I'll copy that div and create another input with an ID of message, or let's name it feedback. The type here is text, however, and here we just say your feedback. And actually, let's use a text area. That's more realistic, I guess. So we have a text area with an ID of feedback, and let's say a number of 5 rows. And then we add a button to submit that form, send feedback. If we adjust the homepage like this, and we reload just localhost 3000, we see this form here. Now it is ugly, you could add styling, but this is totally not about the styling. This is just a dummy form which I add so that I can show you how we can interact with API routes. We'll see a more beautiful example in the next course section when we apply what we learn in this section to our first course project. So here we accept the email address and some user feedback. And of course, when that button is clicked, the idea is that this feedback is sent to some database, for example, that it's stored in some database. Now, we shouldn't talk to a database from our front-end application. It would be kind of difficult to implement, and that would be difficult for a reason. Because it's highly insecure if we would try to add JavaScript code to this component to talk to a database. Because we would have to expose our database credentials in this front-end code for this. And that would be highly insecure. Attached you'll find an article and video where I talk about this in greater detail. So that's not what we want to do. Instead, that's the perfect scenario for an API route. We fetch that user input on the front end, and once the user then clicks that button, we send a request to that API route, so to our own API, and then in that API route, we could connect to a database. Because then there we can safely do so because the code written in the API route will not be exposed to the front end. It will not be exposed to our website visitors. So here we could securely talk to a database. And therefore now here in index.js, I now want to get that user input when the button is clicked and send a request. Now for this, I will work with references here to get references to my inputs. So I'll import useRef from React to use this ref feature. And then I'll set up 2 references here. The first one is for the email input. And then the second one thereafter is for the feedback input. Now, once we got these references created, we can assign them to our elements with the special ref prop. And that's just standard React code, has nothing to do with API routes. And here I'll then just point at the email input ref, and here I'll point at the feedback input ref. Now we need a handler for the form submission, so I'll add a function here, submit form handler, the name is up to you, where we get an event object automatically because I'll bind that to the onSubmit prop on the form, so it will be triggered when that built-in submit event is triggered, when that is fired. And then we get access to that event object, and we need access because here I want to call prevent default to prevent that browser default where the page would basically be reloaded because the browser sends a request automatically. I don't want that browser behavior here, Instead, I want to step in and send the request myself through JavaScript. For this here, we can now extract the entered email text by reaching out to the email input ref, and then there, since it's a ref.current, that's always how refs work, and then .value, because in .current, a pointer at this input object is saved, and this input object, just as the text area object in JavaScript, always has a value property which holds the current value of those inputs. So it holds the value entered by the user. That's the entered email. And then we can also get the entered feedback, of course, by reaching out to the feedback input ref.current.value as well. Now we could add validation and check if the email or feedback is empty. We could do that here to then show an error message to the user, but I'll not do it here because it's not the focus of this section. Instead, now we got these two values, and we might want to send them to our API route here to then there accept them, extract them, and save them in a database. And therefore, in the next step, we will work on that API route. So we got this feedback API route here, and now as part of that function, I want to accept an incoming request with the email and feedback data, and then store that somewhere in a database, in a file, or for development, maybe also just in an array. And therefore, to implement this, we now have to do one important thing. Inside of this handler function, we have to find out which kind of request is triggering this API route. Because when we submit that form here, I soon want to send a HTTP request with JavaScript, and I'll do this with the fetch function here. We could also use a third-party library like Axios. That does not matter. But I'll send a request from inside my JavaScript code. And I will send a post request because I don't want to get data, instead I want to send data. So we would typically use a post or maybe also a put request. Now, since that's the goal, here inside of that handler, we need to find out which kind of request is triggering this function execution. Because by default, all kinds of requests will trigger this function execution. Get requests, post requests, put, delete, everything. Now, I only want to try and extract data from the request and store it in a database or somewhere else if it's a post request though. So therefore here we need an if check, and we need to find out which kind of request was sent. And that's easily done with help of that request object, which we get automatically by Next.js when this function executes. This will give us information about the incoming request, and for example there we'll have a method property which allows us to find out which HTTP method was used. And we can simply check if that was a post request here, if it's a post method. And if that's the case, then inside of this if check, we could try to extract data from the incoming request and then store that extracted data in a database. Now let's say we expect our incoming post requests to this API route to have this email and feedback text data field in the request body. That is something we could expect because we're the ones writing the code for this API. Then we can easily extract data from the incoming request with help of more properties that exist on this request object. To be precise, with help of the body property which exists there. This will be the already parsed body of that incoming request. So Next.js will automatically parse the incoming request body for us, so it will give us easy access to the data attached to the request through that body property. And then body will just be the value that was sent with the request. So let's say here in our front end, we will soon send a request which carries a body of a JavaScript object with an email field with some data and with a text field with some feedback text data. That could be the structure we want to use in this application. And since we are the developer of this application, of this website, we can of course use any structure we want. So now we would send this object with a request to that API route. So on that API route, we could now expect that on this body, we get our email with request body.email, because we have an object as a body which has an email property, and it also has a text property, so we can extract that as well. We can also get our feedback text by accessing request.body.text then. So that's how we can extract the data from the incoming request if it's a post request, and then here we could store that in a database. So here we could create a new feedback object where we add this email and text, and then maybe also add a unique ID to have, a unique identifier for every new feedback. And here, during development, I'll just create a new date object and convert that to a string. It's not a perfect unique ID because theoretically, 2 requests could be sent and handled at exactly the same time, but during development, that's good enough. It's a dummy ID we can use here. So now we would create this feedback object, and we could now store that in a database or in a file or anything like that. Now here during development, I will store it in a file, and I'll create a new data folder. The folder name is up to you though, in my root project folder. So not inside of Pages API. You should not create it there, but just in my root project folder. And in there, I'll add a feedback.json file. The file name is up to you though. And my goal is to open that file and store my data in there when we, get that feedback. For this, I will import fs from fs, so import the file system Node.js module. And we can use Node.js code here because this will run on the server, and this will only run on the server, never somewhere else. And it will be executed with Node.js, so we can use all the Node.js features here. And I'll also import the path Node.js module here. And then here we can store that in a file by constructing a path with the join method to that data folder and there the feedback.json file, by getting access to the current working directory with process current working directory, which will refer to the overall project directory, then diving into data and then into feedback.json. And this will create an absolute path to that folder for us. So that's my file path then. And then we can use the fs module to write to a file. And here I want to write to that file path. And then the data which I want to write is actually this data. However, to be precise, I actually want to read the file first, fetch the data which is in the file, and then override it with the updated data. And therefore, to do that, I'll first of all read the file. And I'll do this with read file sync to do it in a synchronous blocking way. So I'll read that file here, and that gives me my file data, so the data which is currently stored in that file. And that will be some JSON data, so I'll now convert it to a JavaScript object to work with it by executing JSON parse file data. Then that data should be an array, let's say, and therefore I'll add an empty array inside of this feedback JSON file as a start. So this is an empty array for now. And then we interact with that array. We know that it will be an array because we own that file. And I push my new feedback into that array. And then I want to write it back to the disk. So then I use write file, and I'll use write file sync to again do this in a blocking way here. And I'll write my file here by again targeting that file in that file path. And now the data which I write back is again the data converted back to JSON with the JSON stringify method. I pass in my updated data here, and that then writes the data to the disk. That's the goal. That's how this should behave. And then once we're done with all of that, we want to send back a response. So then here I'll set a response of, or with the status code of 201, which signals success. We added data successfully. And then any data of our choice, for example, an object, sent back as JSON, where I say success in my message property, and where I maybe also send back the new feedback object that was created. So that will send back a response after we successfully updated our file, and it sends back an object in JSON format with a message and a feedback property. This line of code would also execute though after we go through this if check, because function execution does not stop just because we set some response data. Hence, to not send two responses, which would cause problems, we should move this code into an else block so that this does not execute if we just make it here into this if check. Okay, so now we spent a lot of time on that, but now we got some server-side code added to this API route using API route specific features like looking into the request, extracting request body data, and running server-side code and sending a response. And with all that added, we can now connect our front-end code to that backend by sending that request to that API route to then see whether that works. So let's now connect everything, and for this in the front-end index.js file, I now really want to send a HTTP request when the form is submitted. So for this here, I will use that fetch function, and now we need the URL to which the request should be sent. Now since we will target this API route, the URL will be our current domain, and then just /API/feedback. We don't need to encode our current domain here, because if we start with a slash here, this will automatically be appended as an absolute path right after our domain. So it will be sent to the same domain automatically. And then there to the path /API/feedback, targeting that feedback file here. Now we want to configure this request though, and set the method to post. This is very important, so that we send a post HTTP request, because of course we're looking for these kinds of requests here in our API route code. Then we also need to add our body, so the data that should be appended to the request. And we do this with the body property. Now that data should be an object containing the entered email and feedback, and it should be an object with an email and a text property, because that's what we're trying to access inside of our API route. So here I'll then just create my request body object, let's say, with an email property of entered email and a text property of entered feedback. And then that's the body I want to set here, but not as a standard JavaScript object, but instead converted to JSON with help of that JSON stringify method. Now we should also make it super clear that we're sending JSON data by adding some special header with help of the headers property, which takes an object, where we add the content type header, so a key of content type added to this header object, which is set to application JSON. And my key name is wrapped between single quotes here because I have a special character in this property name, which wouldn't be allowed otherwise. So now we add this object to add metadata to this request which we're sending, informing the backend, informing the API route in the end, that this request will carry JSON data. That is required for the API routes feature for Next.js, therefore, to correctly parse the incoming request body and convert JSON to JavaScript for us so that we can conveniently access it as we're doing it here. So that's how we send this request now. And then here we can also listen to the response and extract the JSON data from that, and then work with that data and maybe just console log the data for the moment. So we're just sending the request, and then for the response, we're just extracting the data and then logging the data. Using the then methods here because fetch returns a promise. With all that done, if you save everything, you should be able to go back to your page and then enter any data of your choice here and click Send Feedback. And now to find out whether this worked, we can go to the feedback.json file, and in there you should now have an array which does contain one object with the ID property, which is set to some automatically created ID, email, and text with values being equal to the values you just entered here. So that was now updated automatically because of our API route code here. And if I send another feedback like does this work again from test2@test.com, if I click send feedback and we have a look at feedback.json again, we see now that this was stored in there as well. And it's this array which is being updated over time here, which gets longer and longer with more and more elements. And this is all JSON data in there, which is why the property names are wrapped by double quotes. It looks like JavaScript, like a JavaScript object, and that's the entire idea behind JSON. It's this JavaScript object notation, but it isn't a JavaScript object. It indeed just looks like it. It is JSON formatted data, because that's what we're doing in the feedback API route. And now with that, we achieved something important. Now in our next application, we are also able to work with submitted data. We're not limited to just returning pages for GET requests. And that allows us to add features like newsletter signup, feedback submission, comments, or any other kind of data that should be submitted maybe. And you don't have to build a separate API as a separate project. Instead, you can easily add API routes your website might need as part of your Next.js project. That's why API routes are a great and very useful feature. Okay, so now we know what API routes are, that we can write server-side code there, Node.js code to be specific, that we can handle different kinds of requests, that we can extract data and then run any kind of Node.js code we want. We can then also send back a response or different responses depending on the kind of request sent. So for example, if I still enter a request and send it to /API/feedback through the browser URL bar, that will automatically be a GET request. Therefore, it will not trigger this if block, or it'll not make it into this if block because the method is not post, but get. And therefore, this line of code will execute, which is why we see this response. And now that we got this response, of course, let me also make it crystal clear that you can also handle incoming GET requests in whichever way you want. So for example, here, let's say for incoming GET requests, we wanna get access to all our feedback objects that were stored and return those as JSON. So that in our front-end application, we could also send a behind-the-scenes request to fetch all feedback entries and display them on the screen. So to achieve this in our API feedback route, I will basically repeat the code from up there to get access to my file. And hence we can copy that code, or to avoid code duplication, create helper functions like build feedback path, let's say, where I simply return this file path which I create here. So where I return this so that down there we can just execute build feedback path and then do this again here in the else block. And also to then get our file data, we can create another function. Extract feedback could be the function name. And in extract feedback, I, in the end, want to execute that code. So we can copy that code, move that in there, expect the file path as a parameter, and then simply return the parsed data as a response. And then below here in that code, we can now get our data by calling extract feedback and passing our file path as an argument. With that refactoring, we can repeat that down here in the else block. And then we got that extracted and parsed feedback data in that data constant. And hence, instead of sending back this dummy "this works" message, we could send back our feedback, our data, which we're extracting from the feedback file. And if we do that and save this, if I now reload /API/feedback, we see that this also works. But of course, we typically don't add an API route so that users have to enter them in their URL bar. That's not the user experience we typically want to offer. Instead, maybe on localhost /3000, we want to have a button that loads all the stored feedback items from that API route, or with help of that API route, when it's clicked. So on Next.js, below the form, I'll add a horizontal line and then a button where I say load feedback. And when that button is clicked, I want to send a GET request to my feedback API route to trigger this else block and get that feedback data. For this, in the front end, in Next.js, in my homepage component, I add another function which should be triggered when this new button is clicked. And that could be the load feedback handler function. Name is up to you. And in there, I also want to send a fetch request to /API feedback. So I will actually copy that code from up there and paste it in here, but I'll not set this configuration object because here I do want to send a GET request. I have no extra data that should be added to the request, and I therefore also don't need to set any headers. So just sending a GET request by just passing in the URL is enough. Now let's connect this load feedback handler to this button here through the onClick prop. Load feedback handler. And then we can, of course, do more useful things with our data here as well. Currently, we're just logging it to the console. We could also set some state that renders the feedback items. So let's maybe do that. Let's import use state from React, and let's register some state here by calling use state. And let's say initially we have an empty array for our feedback items state, and then a set feedback items updating function. So that could be state which we now use in the homepage component. And now I want to set my state whenever I did fetch my feedback data. So then here in the load feedback handler, instead of logging the feedback to the console, I'll call set feedback items to update that feedback state. And I want to update it with that data that was fetched. Now keep in mind that the data we're sending back will be an object with a feedback property which holds the actual data parsed from the feedback JSON file, and therefore it's this feedback property which will give us access to that feedback array stored in that file. Hence, when we work with our response data on the front end, we want to set data.feedback as our feedback items, because that is then accessing that feedback property which is being set on the response and which therefore does hold those feedback items in that array. And now we're setting that state, and we can now use that state in our homepage component below the button to simply output an unordered list of feedback items which we map to list items, where I then, for example, simply output item.text, because my feedback items, as stored in feedback JSON, do have a text property, and these are the items we're working with here. So we can output the text here, and since we're mapping, also set a key to item.id as a unique identifier per item. With all that implemented, if we save everything again, if I click load feedback, you see that data shows up here. And if I reload the page and open the network tab, you see that if I click load feedback, a request is sent to feedback. It's a GET request to my domain /API/feedback. And there on the response, you see we got that feedback data as JSON. So that is how we can then also send a GET request to an API route. And the special thing here is that we do this behind the scenes with JavaScript on the already loaded page. Now let's make this a bit more complex. What if I don't just want to have my load feedback button here, but I also want to have a, let's say, /feedback route here. So not /API/feedback, but just /feedback, which should load a new HTML page. So a page rendered in the browser, which also lists my feedback. So now I want to add a new normal page, not an API route, but I want to add a new normal page. That is still possible. We can still add a feedback.js file here as well in the pages folder, but outside of API. Or, as you learned, alternatively, add a feedback folder with an index.js file in there. That's the equivalent to having a file named feedback.js on the level above. And that's therefore what I'll go with here. And then in this index.js file, inside of that feedback folder, we can again create our regular component, the feedback page component, which we export. And then here we can, of course, also render our list of feedbacks. And we can now, of course, also just fetch our feedback data whenever that component is rendered. For example, with help of useEffect to implement client-side data fetching, as you learned it in the data fetching section. But maybe we also want to pre-render this page and pre-fetch the data for pre-rendering. And that is something which we would do by exporting an async function called getStaticProps. That's what you also learned before in this course. We can still use these features even if we also use API routes in the project. Of course, I would say, because using API routes is an extra feature. It doesn't change the way Next.js works. So we can still add regular pages with features like getStaticProps to also have some server-side or Node.js code that is executed there when this page is pre-rendered. Now the interesting thing is though, what if we now here want to fetch our feedback data for pre-rendering this page? So here through props in this component, I expect to get my feedback items, let's say, and I want to map them into list items, where I then still output item.text and where I then still have my key set to item.id. But now feedback items should be received through props with help of getStaticProps. How can we now make that work? Well, we did see similar examples in the data fetching sections. There we, for example, also talked to Firebase, and we then used the fetch API here, the fetch function, here inside of getStaticProps to still send a request to an API and get data from there. And that works as you saw there. But whilst this is absolutely fine for external APIs, like the Firebase API, you should not use fetch inside of getStaticProps or getServerSideProps to talk to your own API. Instead, since this is all part of one project and therefore ultimately all served by one server, what you should do instead is write any Node.js logic that should execute here directly inside of getStaticProps. So if we have some logic in our API route, which also might need to be executed here inside of a regular page, then we should just make it available through an export so that we can run the code defined in the API route directly here inside of getStaticProps or getServerSideProps. So that means that here in this case, this code for building the feedback path and extracting the feedback should be executed directly here in getStaticProps. We just don't want to set some response status code and return a response, because that's not what getStaticProps is about. This is just about producing the data for our page component. But since I already have extract feedback and build feedback path in separate functions, we can just export these functions to make them available outside of this API feedback.js file, export both functions, and then in index.js we can import these functions. We can import from going up one level, diving into API, diving into feedback, and import from there. Or we put those functions into a separate other folder and file right from the start. We could add a helpers folder on the root project level and store our functions in some file in there. That would also be fine. But here I'm importing from that API feedback file, and I'll import the build feedback path function and the extract feedback function. Now the cool thing is that Next.js will detect that what we're importing here is in the end code that we'll only use inside of getStaticProps, and therefore that code will still not be included in the client-side bundle. I talked about this in earlier sections already. Code used in getStaticProps and dependencies used in there, so imports used in there, will not end up in the client-side code bundle if we're not using that code anywhere in our client-side code. So therefore here we can now call build feedback path to construct our file path here. And then we can get access to our data by calling extract feedback and passing in the file path. And then we just return our standard object with the props key, as we always do it in getStaticProps. And we expose our feedback items, because that's what I'm looking for on my props here, which is my data. Because the data I'm extracting is that extracted array from feedback.json. So now we have that code here inside of our regular page instead of using fetch and sending a request to our own API route. Because when working with your own API routes and when requiring them in your regular pages, you should not send the HTTP request to them, but instead leverage the fact that it's all running on the same computer, on the same server. And therefore, just import it and directly run that code instead of sending that unnecessary HTTP request. And with that, if we save all of this and I visit my domain/feedback, you see that is also showing up there. And if we view the page source, we see that it was pre-rendered because of getStaticProps. So that is how you should interact with your API routes when you're using that data for pre-rendering a page, no matter if you're using getStaticProps or getServer-side props. Okay, so now we also know how to work with our API routes inside of getStaticProps. We don't send a request there, we just execute the code directly in getStaticProps or getServer-side props. Now let's talk about dynamic API routes. What's that? Well, let's say you don't just want to have /API/feedback, which handles post and get requests, but you also want to support /API/feedback/some feedback ID to just fetch the single piece of data for that specific feedback item. Because maybe you need that somewhere on your page. For example, on the feedback page, you could say that for every list item you're rendering here, you also have like a show details button. And when that button is clicked, you want to show the details for that feedback item. And hence you want to fetch the data, the full data for that feedback item. Now we are, of course, actually fetching the full feedback data here, and we could just use client-side JavaScript to use that already loaded data for that. But let's assume that we're not fetching the full data here, but that instead we are only getting the ID and the text and not the email address. And therefore, when this button is clicked, we want to fetch the full data again, but not for all feedback items, but for this single feedback item. And that's what you could use a dynamic API route for. Because we already know dynamic pages, where you create a page with that square bracket notation like this. This would then allow for a request sent to /feedback/some ID, and some ID would be interpreted as a value for this ID placeholder. And you could then use it inside of that page component and so on. That's what we already learned before. Now that's for regular pages. We can use a similar feature for API routes, because it's also not unrealistic that we want to send a request to /API/feedback and then the ID of a specific feedback to then load the data for that specific feedback. And for this, we need a new file, because here in feedback.js, we only handle requests to /API/feedback/nothing. Hence, in the API folder, we can add a dynamic API route, and we do that in exactly the same way as we do it for regular pages. We use square brackets and then any placeholder name of our choice, like for example ID or feedback ID or whatever you want. And I'll go with feedback ID. So now we have a dynamic API route file. In there, we still define our handler function and we still export that. So just as in the other file, because it works in exactly the same way. This API route works in exactly the same way, it's just dynamic. So for dynamic path segments. So therefore in here, we might now want to fetch the data for a specific piece of feedback. And for that, of course, we need to know which concrete value was encoded in the URL as a value for this placeholder. And we can get access to that again through this request object, which we should accept together with that response object. And there we learned that we have body for accessing the submitted data, method for finding out which kind of request it was, and we also have query for getting access to query parameters and regular parameters. So we can get access and get our feedback ID by accessing rec.query.feedbackID. .feedbackID because I encoded feedback ID between the square brackets here in my file name. So that gives us access to the concrete feedback ID that was part of the URL when that request hit that handler. And now we can use that feedback ID to retrieve a specific feedback item from the feedback.json file. For this, I still want to get access to that file, so I will still import my two functions from that other file here. So from the feedback.js file, the build feedback path and the extract feedback functions. Again, we could outsource them in some global helpers file if we wanted to. And then I'll construct my file path by calling build feedback path and get my feedback data by calling extract feedback and passing file path as an argument. Now feedback data is then an array of all items, and now here I just want to get all the data for one specific item. So since this is an array, we can of course just call feedback data.find to find one single item, which then executes a function on every item to find out whether that is the item we're looking for or not. And the item we're looking for is the item where feedback.id is equal to feedback ID. So that is then the selected feedback, and that's the kind of data we now want to send back with that for incoming requests. And for this, we use the response object, set a status of 200, and set our JSON response body data, which could carry an items key, which is an object here where I set the feedback key, let's say, to selected feedback. And now that would return a feedback for a selected ID. Now, just to make that crystal clear, your dynamic API routes cannot just handle GET requests. Here, I'm not checking the request method at all, which means that for all incoming requests, I'm just sending back this JSON data. But we could also check the request method here and do something different for post requests if we needed to. For example, you could check for delete requests, and if a delete request is sent for a specific feedback ID, you could execute some code that deletes that feedback from our stored feedback items. It's not a functionality I need here, but it is something you could also build. So dynamic routes work for all request methods, put, post, delete, get, and so on. And you can, of course, differentiate what you do inside of your handler function with if checks. Here, I just want to return my selected feedback no matter which method was used though, and therefore that's the code we can use. Now we added this API route, now we can use it in our feedback page. Here, when this button is clicked, I want to send a request to this dynamic API route to fetch the details for a single feedback. And for this, in the feedback page component, we can add a function, load feedback handler, or whatever you want to call it. And then in here, send a request. So now let's connect load feedback handler to this button with onClick. And in load feedback handler, we now need to know for which ID to load the feedback. So we expect ID as a parameter. And to make sure that this ID is passed in, when we bind our load feedback handler to the onClick prop, when we pass it into onClick, I'll call bind on that function, which is a built-in JavaScript method to pre-configure this function for future execution. If it's not clear how bind works, attached you find an additional resource on that which clarifies it. Bind in the end allows us to pre-configure this function, so it does not execute the function yet, but it pre-configures it for future execution. And it, for example, allows us to pre-configure parameter values that will be received here. Now, the first value, the first argument we pass to bind is a value for the this keyword inside of this function. We don't care about that here, so we can set this to null. And then the second value we pass to bind will be the value for the first argument, the first parameter received by that function. And here that should be item.id, so that this button, when it's clicked, for this function execution uses the ID of the item we're currently rendering. So that's then the value which we receive here. And then we can use the fetch function to again send a request. Send a request to /API/ and then the feedback ID. So we add ID to that path. Or we build that with the template literal notation with backticks and send this to /API/ and inject ID like this. Either way, this produces a URL like /API/ some feedback ID, and that will then trigger this dynamic route. Now we're still working with promises here, so we'll then still add a then block to get our response eventually and parse that data. We could also add error handling here, but I'll not do it here to keep this shorter. And then we got this data which we can use in this second then block. Now here we might want to render the details. So again, we can use state for this to update our component and what's rendered once we got the data. So from React, I'll import use state here and then set up some state for this component. The feedback data, let's say, with the set feedback data state updating function where we call use state. And initially that's undefined. We have no starting value. But in this then block, once we have the data fetched from our API, we can call set feedback data to set data.feedback like this as our new state. Now data.feedback, because in this dynamic API route, I'm setting a feedback property in that response object. So that is the property holding the selected feedback data. So that full feedback object fetched from feedback.json. And therefore it's this property named feedback, which I want to access here in my front-end code as well as my feedback data. That is then that object fetched from feedback.json, which I set as my feedback data here. Now, when that's called, the component will be re-evaluated because the state changed. And we can utilize this to output the email address for this feedback. So when that button was clicked, we now want to show the email address. And since I always just have feedback data for one specific feedback loaded, the way my component is designed here, I'll do this above the unordered list, use fragment, import it from React, because adjacent JSX code isn't allowed otherwise. Move that in here, and then here render something conditionally. If feedback data is set, then I want to output, let's say, a paragraph where I just output feedback data.email. .email, because feedback data will be a single piece of data from feedback.json, so such an object. And in those objects, we do have an email property. So we can access that here. And then we'll show up the data for the loaded feedback for a single piece of feedback above the list of feedbacks. Now that is of course all just some very basic unstyled dummy code to show you how you can interact with those API routes. Hence, if we now save everything and reload /feedback, we do have the show details button. And if we click it, we see eventually the email address of that feedback shows up at the top. Now, as mentioned before, this is kind of redundant because with getStaticProps, we already fetch the full feedback data. So we have all that data exposed through props in that component already. So sending another request for a single piece of data here is redundant. But of course, it's not redundant for you to know about this dynamic API route feature, which is why I used this example for showing this to you. Because this is how you can send requests to dynamic API routes and how you can set up dynamic API routes to execute server-side code for dynamic pieces of data encoded in the path. Now we know about API routes, including dynamic API routes. Now it is worth a note that there are some alternatives to how we name and structure our files inside of the API folder. And those alternatives are equivalent to the different approaches we can use for regular pages. For example, you can also have catch-all dynamic API routes by adding 3 dots in front of any placeholder name of your choice. This will then not just handle requests to /API/some value, but also to more segments you might have. Equivalent to what you learned about regular pages and catch-all pages. Now we don't need a catch-all dynamic API route here, but it is worth knowing about it. It's also important to understand how Next.js prioritizes these different files. If we send a request to /API/feedback, it's the code in the feedback.js file that will be executed. Now, that is not necessarily obvious because we have this dynamic API route. So it could also be possible that requests to /API/feedback are consumed by this file because feedback is simply treated as a concrete value for this feedback ID placeholder. But Next.js is smart, just as it is for regular pages. And if there is a more specific page for a given path value, so since we have a feedback.js file in this case, it will use that more specific file, which makes more sense for this kind of path than the more generic dynamic file. /API some value, on the other hand, would trigger the code in the dynamic API route. So that's just worth knowing. It automatically works correctly here, but it is important to be aware of the fact that Next.js will do this prioritization for you. Now, another important thing to know is that you have some flexibility regarding how you structure your files. You can add a feedback.js file in the API folder to support requests to /API/feedback. Alternatively, just as with regular pages, you could also add a feedback subfolder in the API folder and then move the file in there and rename it to index.js. And here VS Code is asking me whether it should automatically update all imports that pointed at this file. And I will say yes. If you don't get that prompt or you chose no, you should manually update those import paths. So that is the alternative. A file named index.js in the feedback folder in the API folder is the equivalent to having a feedback.js file inside of the API folder, just as it works for regular pages. We can also move our feedback ID.js file in there. But if we do that, that of course also changes the way our API works. Previously, since feedback ID, this dynamic API route, was directly in the API folder, previously /API some value triggered the code in this feedback ID file. Now, since we're in the feedback subfolder, it's actually /API/feedback/some value that triggers the code in here. Now, that is actually a path that makes more sense to me. It's more descriptive. It's clearer that some request sent to /API/feedback/some value should fetch more details for a single feedback than if we have just /API/f1. That doesn't tell us that it's about fetching feedback data if we just look at this kind of path. And hence I will keep this structure of having the square bracket feedback ID file inside of the feedback folder, inside of the API folder. However, that means that in the index.js file in the feedback folder in the regular pages, so in the feedback page component, we also need to update this URL and send our request to /API/feedback/some ID, because I changed that structure in the APIs folder. And now it looks like I broke some imports as well. Yes, here we should import from the index file. And now that works again. So if I now reload, that all works, that works, looking good. So that is how you can also structure your files and folders in the API folder, in the pages folder. It essentially works just as it does for regular pages. And that's it for API routes. Another very useful feature Next.js offers to you, a feature which you won't need in every project you're building. Not every Next website needs API routes, but if you have some backend functionality that should be triggered through client-side code, like we're doing it here for loading feedback or for storing feedback, then API routes can be super useful, because they allow you to add extra functionality to your website, which might rely on an API, like users sign up for a newsletter, without having to build an extra API backend, without having to build a totally different project. Instead, you can easily inject API routes as we're doing it here by using this special API folder in the pages folder, and you can write server-side code here, which is then triggered for requests to these API routes. And here you learned that you can find out which kind of request was sent, that you can extract request body data, and that you can send back responses with different status codes and also with different kind of data. You learn about static API routes and dynamic API routes and how you can structure your files and folders here. And with that, you got another important tool in your toolbox, which allows you to really build any kind of project and any kind of website you want, because Next.js has all the features you need for that.